Welcome to RJI's podcast series hosted by RJI President Lisa Ray. Restorative Justice International is an association and network of over 6,000 members and affiliates. In this podcast series, Lisa interviews leaders from around the world who support restorative justice, including crime victims, ex-offenders, exonerees, and human rights experts. In these podcasts, you will hear from key thought leaders who support systemic justice reform based on restorative justice principles. Now here's Lisa Ray.
Greetings. It's so great to be here today at the India Restorative Justice Conference, co-sponsored by Restorative Justice International and ICFA Law School in Hyderabad, India.
Hello and good morning from Australia. The focus of the conference is going to be victims-driven restorative justice, restoration of victims and offender accountability through restorative justice. So it's all about restorative justice. And today I'm interviewing founder and president Lisa Ray. Among Lisa's accomplishments was to conduct a pilot for the first sycamore tree project, and I'm very heavily involved with the sycamore tree project in Australia as a result of Lisa's good work. Lisa, would you tell us a little bit about how you began in the area of restorative justice?
Yes, it'll be great to do that. And let me say for our listeners and viewers that Martin is a colleague of Restorative Justice International and sits on our Global Advisory Council. But my background is that I've been in the field for 25 years and I first worked in restorative justice in the state of California, where I was the state director of a group called Justice Fellowship that was connected to Prison Fellowship Ministries. And I also worked for Prison Fellowship International, which is where I think I met Martin. And then we founded Restorative Justice International in 2008.
We started working really on the early website design because I have a background in that area. And as any organization that is starting up, we needed a logo and we need to have a look and a style that would be befitting of an international organization. And so I created the first website, and I've been working on the website ever since in various ways, and that's blossomed into podcasts and organizing conferences and various visual things that need to be done. And it's been quite a fruitful association, hasn't it?
It sure has. It sure has. And let me just back up too. And what I didn't add was that I have a strong legislative background. I worked in the California legislature for 3 members, and I was a subcommittee consultant there on welfare reform. But Restorative Justice International, let me talk a little bit about the organization. Again, it was founded, I was the founder, and I'm the founder in 2008. And our mission is to focus on victims-driven restorative justice. And so we support criminal justice reform based on restorative justice principles. So we have members and affiliates, and we have a 19-member Global Advisory Council, which Martin sits on, and 18 others, including Dr. Upneet Lally, who's there at the conference with you, who also sits on our Global Advisory Council, as I said. So we are an advocacy organization, and we work to educate those who are interested in criminal justice systemic criminal justice reform based on restorative justice. And we do a lot of work around the world, and a lot of it's online, a lot of it's on social media through LinkedIn, through Facebook, and through our website. So that's a quick one. And then let me also discuss why victims-driven restorative justice is so important. So we work with a lot of crime victims in the United States and globally. And we tell their stories. In fact, 2 of those stories you'll hear through this conference are from Alva Griffith from Ireland and Austin Stack, who will tell their stories about why they support restorative justice. But it's so important to hear victims supporting restorative justice because their voices is what really changed the system. And we think that taking a position on restorative justice based on what victims see and what they experience is critical.
I would just add there that at the ground level, when you have victims in the room, it changes the entire dynamic. We find this every time we run the Sycamore Tree Project, that we have people in there who find it difficult to talk, especially inmates are struggling with all sorts of complications in their past and their the crime they committed, and to have victims in that room talking about their experience is actually a catalyst, a vivid kind of catalyst for them, for those inmates to start talking about their experience. And that's a critical opening point for their rehabilitation and their ability to take responsibility. So I'm interested in how restorative justice is changing globally, Lisa. You and I have been involved in this work and seen it grow in a lot of different ways. There's a whole different set of applications and opportunities for restorative justice. So I'm curious about the things that you're seeing, the big changes that you've been involved in, and some of the people who are involved. So could you tell us a little bit about how it's expanded, say, in the last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, and I will mention in more detail what we've been discussing, the Sycamore Tree Project. But let me start with a couple additional issues. So one is restorative policing. So taking the concept of restorative justice and applying it to policing is really important, and something that we've seen kind of take off. RJI did a white paper on that subject and also a podcast. I think it was in 2011. And you can find that on our website, where we really dive deep and talk about the need for restorative justice in policing. And that's particularly whenever there's violent encounters between citizens and law enforcement officers. So again, to take the principles of restorative justice and apply it to policing. And secondly, something called restorative environmental justice. Some people say environmental restorative justice, but either way. So it's taking restorative justice and applying it to environmental crime, which includes any time that there's harm of the environment, even climate change. So that's a very exciting concept. I can't say it's caught on in a huge way, but in Europe, there's actually quite a bit of discussion. RGI did a podcast with Brunilde Paley from Belgium, and we discussed that, and that can be found on our website under podcasts. And again, Martin produces our podcast for us, but we have something like 50 podcasts up on there. The third one is what we've been discussing. So it's Sycamore Tree Project. So it's an in-prison restorative justice project. And I directed the first project in the state of Texas in 1998. So it's inside a prison, bringing victims and offenders together in small groups. And that's what Martin's talking about in Queensland, Australia, that he's actually used the same model there through Prison Fellowship. But what was really amazing for me is, since my background is a legislative advocate and a lobbyist, I had never seen the application of restorative justice in a prison context. So I was asked at the time by the person I was working for, Dan Van Ness, who was with Prison Fellowship International. He asked me to direct that pilot. And it was a huge eye-opener for me to see that you could take the principles and apply it to a program inside a prison. So, Martin, do you want to add a little more to that?
Well, first of all, it was a very strategic moment. I think many people from around the Prison Fellowship International community were looking to see how these pilots came out, because it was an unusual thing and a very fresh thing. And we were really excited to find out how successful they ran. And Lisa and her colleagues gave us very detailed accounts and notes of what went on during those conferences and in between times, to give us an up-close picture of what was going on. And for us in Australia, that enabled us to think carefully about what we needed to accomplish to get the program started, the kind of conversations we needed to have with prison managers so that they could run it. And so that's what we did. We got down and started organizing and getting people involved. And also, this was a critical mind shift for our association, that we'd traditionally been serving prisoners only. And it took quite an amount of discussion and some conferences and seminars that I ran for our local organization to explain how this connected with what we were doing. Because we've got the mindset in the community that, what do victims have to do with this work? And then in the practical sense, we were trying to apply this in our organization. So that meant starting a whole new area of thought. And we look back at it now and think that it's a fairly natural thing to do, but still people struggle with the idea. But what we've been able to accomplish in breakthroughs for prisoners that we've been working with for many years, some of them are carrying around this stuff for like 10 years and they just will not talk about it. But the Sycamore Tree Project is the thing that breaks through that tough shell. And we've seen it happen exactly the same way every time. But there's something else special about the Sycamore Tree Project that makes it really another breakthrough program, which is we bring in visitors to the last session. That's a brilliant innovation, because it means that restorative justice becomes visible to people outside. We can bring them in and say, okay, this is how it works. These people were kind of very edgy about each other at the beginning, and look at them now. They're embracing and showing kindness to each other, and they're talking about massive personal changes that have occurred. So that's a tremendous contribution that you've begun, Lisa.
Great. Thank you so much. And I give all the credit to Dan Van Ness, Vice President of Prison Fellowship International. And let me add on this. I realize we didn't say that these are surrogate victims and offenders meeting. So not the actual victim and offenders, but real victims, real offenders. And also since that time in 1998, it could be now about 50 countries where the project has been modeled and replicated. So that's critical. So anyway, that's where Martin and I came together to work together, because we both had a passion for this project. So that's something that RJI now promotes, whether it's this program or ones like it. So let me move on to a couple other new applications for restorative justice globally. So one is wrongful convictions, an issue that we care greatly about. In fact, at the conference there in India, you'll hear from Jeff Deskovic from New York. He was wrongfully convicted of rape and murder, and he sits on our Global Advisory Council. He was exonerated, and he is now a lawyer freeing others. But we connect restorative justice with wrongful convictions. So if you get the wrong person in prison or jail, then you have two victims that you've created, the original victim, and you've created a secondary victim, the innocent person. So we make the case that those that have been exonerated who are innocent need to be paid restitution. They need a public apology and more, especially for the time spent in prison wrongfully. So we do what we can in the US and around the world on that subject. And lastly, we support using restorative justice in response to radical extremism. This is something that we've done some work on, but we'd like to do more. But it's very important to take the principles and apply it to extremism. We work with Professor Don John O'Malley in Nigeria, who's done a great deal of work on, Nigeria. And he's done a lot of work on this issue. And you can find an article that he wrote on our website under news. So Martin, are there other questions?
I'm interested in what you're seeing in the context of the United States in the development of restorative justice, and are there possibilities of increasing that work?
Well, that's interesting. We've seen the work ebb and flow, but I think there's an understanding both in the U.S. and globally, and maybe in India as well, that tough on crime policies don't work. You can't incarcerate everyone and then think you're going to get a result that's going to reflect peace and shalom in our communities. So you need something more to address crime that can bring restoration of victims as much as possible and offender accountability, so that through restorative justice, so that offenders can change and be transformed. And whenever our laws in any country do not reflect those principles, then you're on the wrong track. So we're seeing that there's an openness to these principles, and we just have to keep pressing. There's not one country in the world that does it best. It varies. I mean, sometimes we point to New Zealand, sometimes we point to Australia, Canada, many places, Ireland. You'll hear from Austin and Ava. So it really depends. But I think all countries and those that work for public policy changes understand that we need something new with a new vision that can promote restoration.
And it's so often the crime victims that are leading the debate because they have a radical story and it's very newsworthy and powerful. So often they become advocates informally or publicly, and that's tremendous motivational aspect for our work. And also it's been very strong in schools in the last 20 years probably, but especially the last 10, especially in the United States, the idea of restorative practices. So sometimes treating wrongdoing, but also using those principles in the classroom just to help kids get along and to deal with small conflict, or just to talk about tricky situations that are going on. So that's another area that's blossomed.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, RJI works with many affiliates that are connected to our organization who do work in schools. And if you look on our site and look for affiliates, you'll see the listing.
The way that you're centering victims in our work is very critical, because it's so often the case that victims are not centered in the restorative process, and their needs and interests and potential are not leveraged, and they're, in some cases they can be harmed by a poor restorative justice process. So I think what you're doing in that thought leadership is terrific.
Thank you so much. And we encourage people to look at our podcasts. Like I said, we have a really diverse number of podcasts up there on our site. You'll be surprised how active we've been with conflicts around the world and even wars. So I want to thank the conference today in India for working with Restorative Justice International. We're glad to be a part of it, and we know that your conference is going to be a great success. This is day one. So thank you so much for having us, and thank you, Martin, for this interview today.
Great to be involved, Lisa. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much. And this is Lisa Ray for RJI.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the RJI podcast series with Lisa Ray. Stay in touch and support our work at restorativejusticeinternational.com.